Ryan Alexander was not having a good day, or a good week, and in fact most of the year had been fairly terrible. It reminded him of his worst year at the academy, but without the knowledge that the teachers, drill instructors, and elder students who had tormented him were ultimately on his side in at least some sense. Here, no one was on Ryan's side but Ryan. He supposed one could say this statement always had a degree of truth to it, that no one is ever fully on one's side but oneself, and bits of philosophy like this did help him suffer through the hours in his own head. But the here part of the truism was the most important one, because many light years away he did have others on his side, plenty of them, in this matter if nothing else. This matter. His capture, his imprisonment, his new slow-dying life lived in the service of others who saw him as forever something less. And it could be worse. That was a terrible little proverb, always tapping out some idiotic caper somewhere in the back of his mind. He wondered what this said about him, that much of his psyche seemed to be coping with all this by latching on to comfortingly insipid bits of semi-wisdom. But that was unfair. Unprofound and common did not mean untrue. There really was no one here on Ryan's side but Ryan, and it really could be worse. He was not being tortured. He was fed, even if the food was synthetic and at best lacking in taste. He was not physically harmed, even if his handling could be a bit rough should he misbehave. He was allowed sleep on a reasonably comfortable surface. It could be worse. But it was still very bad, because they were keeping him healthy and relatively comfortable for the worst possible reasons. He was pretty sure, to start with, that eventually they'd like him to simply turn traitor against his species, succumb to a sort of Stockholm syndrome that would plunging down across vastness that separated Ryan from his captors. They would consider it a rise, not a fall. Ryan had rarely met anyone so arrogant as even the most humble of the Sirog. That was what they were called in human languages, but it was also in a way what they called themselves, the vocalization used to identify their species, a brief, self-satisfied exhalation. He wondered about that, sometimes, the self-satisfaction. It was so obvious, even across that gulf they wanted to hurl him down, so strange that a bit of body speak like that could be so close to the same in species with no common ancestor. He wondered about the Stockholm Syndrome expectation too. He supposed that the merciless demands of evolution shaped thinking and breathing beings in certain ways. And that had advantages for him, because he could recognize it. Ryan did not consider himself an especially humble man, but he was a damn bodhisattva compared with his captors. Humanity was the first intelligent species they'd ever encountered, or maybe not. They didn't consider humans truly intelligent, because humans couldn't be, because the Sirog were the only truly intelligent beings in the universe because they had to be. Things could not be any other way. So maybe they had met other intelligent species and simply refused to acknowledge it, or had wiped them out. That seemed to be their plan for humans, but Ryan was pretty sure they were going to fail pretty spectacularly in the end, and that wasn't just species loyalty talking. The more he saw, the more sure he felt. Still, it was still unlikely to happen fast enough to help with his personal situation. Though maybe he could hurry things along. They'd been teaching him their language. Well, sort of. To begin with, he'd already had a pretty decent grasp of it when he was captured, plucked out of his damaged scout ship along with the corpses of his two unfortunate crewmates. He'd thought at the time they'd accuse him of espionage, which would have been a fair cop, and execute him. But admitting that a human were even capable of something as sophisticated as true espionage was not a thinkable thing. So instead, he was given condescending lectures about how his curiosity was understandable, because what lesser creature, after all, would not wish to witness as much as they could of the Sirog civilizational majesty? He'd been accused of no crime. Crimes were something people committed. So they taught him their language, word by word, expecting him to parrot back phrases. They dressed him up in adorable little mockeries of their own clothing. They'd shown him how to wash himself ritually, the way they did, step by excruciatingly simple step. It had been very hard, especially at first, not to simply meet their expectations, not to tell them he already knew all these words, he had the grammar down, didn't need to parrot memorized phrases, and anyway had memorized each string of words with a few minutes. restrain himself from pointing out that their little washing ceremony was something a human 4-year-old could learn in an afternoon, just as theirs did. So he watched their faces, learned which struggles of pronunciation drew the most satisfaction from them, studied their body language even harder than he had with the academy, let them dress him, never attempted to correct the cutesy little ways they draped the garments wrongly over his different-shaped body. And he never quite did the washing ritual right, though he was very thorough, because honestly they smelled and he could never quite seem to get all the stink off. At first he'd gone to great lengths to hide his distaste at their smell, but then realized they knew nothing about human facial expressions, and didn't care to. And then realized again that he absolutely must not fall into that same arrogance trap, and continued to guard his feelings. He was human, after all. Had to remember all the things that meant, not just the good ones. He watched, and waited, and performed. City after city, cage after pretty cage, he butchered Sirog words, bumbled through Sirog ceremonies, tripped over elaborate Sirog garments. An entertainment, a reassurance, a fascinating little primitive novelty. It wore on him. It built up. And so he was not having a good day, feeling the weight of the whole thing, the lack of any definite endpoint, the continuous humiliation even if he was a purposeful party to it. Today was an all-day exhibition, and it was his feeding break. He gulped down the horrible synth-nutrient sludge, drank the stench-tinged water, and allowed himself to stew a moment in his own hate and disgust. Then he realized something he hadn't before. Sirog body language was difficult, in part because it was so heavily influenced by rigid, elaborate cultural context that the really useful stuff, the small unconscious tells, could seem nearly impossible to pick out. So he hadn't noticed, at first, the way their attention often went to the carved armbands they wore on the topmost of their 2 left arms. It was a subtle thing, nothing to do with the eyes, rarely something they touched, all about small movements, a sort of holding out gesture they never really made with any other limb. But now, watching one of his captors sit and stare off into space, trying not to think about the aftertaste suffusing his mouth, Ryan did notice. He knew they must have some sort of invisible interface for their networks, and that some of the bulkier bits of their traditional garb were tech packages, computing, sensors, comms, all that. He also knew that they considered human-style cybernetics to be the height of inelegant butchery, one of the many signs that his primate species was not a truly intelligent one. Ryan watched the woman, not quite an accurate word for the way Sirog sex and gender worked, but they'd consider any instance of a Sirog not being described in the pure Sirog language as offensive, so whatever, for some time while he ate. This was unpleasant, as normally he preferred to shovel his sustenance down as quickly as possible to avoid tasting it as little as possible, but it gave him an excuse to linger. Yes. He was almost sure of it. That was the interface spot. It was good information. Good intelligence, even, something he'd be sure to put in a high-importance report immediately if, no, when, had to think of it as when, he got back in the hands of friendly forces. And that was fine, but he had plenty of information like that. This was different, because it could be of help to him personally. That night, Ryan slept very little. He had good reason for this. The Sirog had not removed his cybernetics, and in fact delighted in showing off the data ports in his head. Look at what these primitive creatures do to themselves. They had put signal-blocking mesh over the antennas in his skull. They weren't entirely stupid in their arrogance. So he couldn't attempt to hack their networks wirelessly. Unless. He lay there, reasonably comfortable on the softish surface they'd provided, thinking. Concentrating. His internal database contained the most complete map of Sirog physiology available at the time he'd been captured. He just hoped it would be enough. Slowly, painfully, a contingent from his precious reserve of nanites began constructing a web of synthetic Sirog nervous tissue from his brain down to his left forearm. The next day was rough. When asked about his apparent lack of energy, he used the stumbling, broken syntax he'd perfected to tell his captors he was slightly ill. That earned him a couple days of rest and isolation. The Sirog found the idea of alien sickness utterly revolting, however unlikely their disparate biology made the prospect of actual transmission. Ryan was as ready as he could be. He waited, and watched, and listened. And performed. Struggled theatrically with the language. Made clumsy gestures. He even found a way to eke primitive-sounding beeping noises from the hardware in his head, which absolutely delighted the Sirog. Opportunity came in the form of a middle-status functionary who had been touring with him as one of his handlers. He was a behind-the-scenes worker who did not appear publicly to show off the primitive, but was sometimes allowed to accompany the others at meals and parties. When the functionary managed to badly stain his most formal outfit at one of these banquets, he had been denied permission to replace it. He was to suffer the consequences of his clumsiness for the rest of that tour. This was a common enough event, and in fact the Sirog's most high-class garments were always made of materials that stained easily and were difficult to clean, to enforce exactly this kind of social punishment. With the added though unspoken benefit that truly high-status Sirog would have more than one set of formal clothing to hand anyway. This time, tough, it gave Ryan an idea. He began talking admiringly about the functionary's outfit, acting as though he'd not understood any of the rapid-fire mockery directed at it, as though he didn't know what had happened at the banquet, as though the stains were too subtle for a primitive such as himself to notice. He even wheedled a little. He wished aloud that he could someday aspire to such fine garments. This amused the functionary's tormentors to no end, of course, to the point that Ryan actually felt a little sorry for the man. "Ah, look, your garments are so very fine that they've caught the human's eye. It seems you have similar tastes. Perhaps we'll give them to him once you're allowed to replace them. Let the creature parade around in your old shame." Really quite a poignant bit of social pathos, but heaven knew Ryan was willing to do quite a bit worse than that in the service of his mission, so he egged the bullying on with innocent-sounding comments and his very best primitive cluelessness. They didn't even bother to deactivate the interface when they altered the garments to semi-fit him. Ryan found that slightly astonishing. He expected to have to perform internal repairs on the functional bits of the garment by giving up more of his nanite reserve, and considered the whole thing something of a long shot. But then, the shifting colors and holographic overlays of formal Sirog garments were probably difficult to separate out from the other components, and it wouldn't be fully mockable without them. And anyway, there was no way for a human to interface with something designed for perfected Sirog physiology. They were very nearly right about that. Even with his new synth nerves, Ryan had a very difficult time getting the interface to work at all. Information came slowly. Commands were opaque. And although he didn't have to perform any internal repairs, he did have to put a fine signal block mesh in place anywhere capable of communicating with external networks. It was exhausting. It was time-consuming. Ryan spent weeks in terror of being caught. But it also paid off, and so did all his training in and observation of Sirog culture and language and psychology. Well, that and his cybernetics, which he was still using to flaunt his alleged primitiveness with loud beeps and even the occasional flamboyant malfunction. He loved the irony. He wished he had someone to share it with. Once he was sure he'd closed off all the system's attempts at outbound signals, Ryan removed the blocking mesh and spent a few weeks just listening. Gathering. Processing. Getting ready. Slowly opening up. Wincing at the first time he authenticated to the network. Sure he would be caught, pushing through his fear and doing it anyway. No risk, no reward. So when a high-ranking Sirog official requested time alone with the docile trained primitive, Ryan was ready, and so was the nanite blade he'd carefully hidden in the right bracer of his stained garment. And as he bled out on the floor along with the official and her two bodyguards, he watched the massive data packet go out, courtesy of the newly acquired bracer on his left arm, this one stained with Sirog blood rather than Sirog beverage. Ryan used the last of his mental strength to make sure everything he'd sent was erased from the system, and smiled.